The dim glow of pendant lights flickered over the polished wooden tables as Vin Diesel slipped through the back door of his own restaurant. His cap pulled low to hide his face. He'd come to check on things quietly, to feel the pulse of the place he'd poured his heart into. But as he stepped into the shadows of the kitchen, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. A soft, broken sob echoing from the break room. It was one of his servers, her voice trembling with a pain that felt too heavy for the late-night hush. What he overheard next would pull him into a story he never expected, one that would test the strength of his own guarded heart. The air inside the restaurant carried the warm, familiar scent of rosemary and roasted garlic, mingling with the faint tang of polished oak. It was well past midnight, the dining room now a quiet sea of empty tables, each chair tucked neatly in place. Vin Diesel moved silently through the back entrance, his broad shoulders hunched slightly under a worn leather jacket. He wasn't here as the celebrity tonight, no cameras, no entourage. This was his place, a haven he'd built from the ground up in a quiet corner of Los Angeles. A dream born from years of wanting something real, something that wasn't just a role on a screen. He'd named it Hearth because it felt like the kind of word that held weight, like family, like home. Tonight, he just wanted to see it breathe, to know it was still alive with the spirit he'd imagined. He eased the door shut behind him, careful not to let it creak. The kitchen was dark, save for the faint glow of a single overhead light casting long shadows across the stainless steel counters. Pots and pans hung in orderly rows, their surfaces gleaming like they'd been scrubbed with care. Vin's boots made soft thuds against the tiled floor as he moved toward the dining area, his eyes scanning the space. He'd always loved this time of night, when the chaos of dinner service gave way to a stillness that felt almost sacred. But as he neared the swinging door to the main floor, a sound cut through the silence. A muffled, uneven sob, raw and unguarded, coming from the small break room tucked behind the kitchen. Vin froze, his hand hovering over the door. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made his chest tighten. It was the kind of crying that wasn't meant to be heard, the kind that spilled out when someone thought they were alone. He glanced around, half expecting to see a manager or another staff member nearby, but the kitchen was empty. The sob came again, softer now, followed by a shaky whisper, words too faint to make out. Vin's first instinct was to keep moving, to let whoever it was have their privacy. He wasn't the type to pry. Life had taught him to guard his own walls carefully. But something in the sound, a thread of desperation, tugged at him, pulling him toward the break room door. He stepped closer, his movements slow, almost reluctant. The break room was little more than a closet-sized space with a folding table, a couple of chairs, and a sagging couch that had seen better days. Through the cracked door, he could see a young woman sitting on the couch, her head bowed, her hands clutching a crumpled tissue. Her server's apron was still tied around her waist, the black fabric streaked with faint stains from the night's work. Her hair, a tangle of dark curls, fell over her face, hiding her eyes, but Vin could see the way her shoulders shook, each sob seeming to pull her smaller. Her name tag glinted faintly in the dim light. Emily. Vin didn't know her well. He'd hired a manager to handle the day-to-day, and his visits were rare, usually late like this when he could slip in unnoticed. But he'd seen Emily before, always moving with a quiet efficiency, her smile quick but never forced. She was one of those servers who remembered customers' names, who knew how to make a table of strangers feel like they belonged. Now, though, that warmth was gone, replaced by a fragility that made Vin's throat tighten. He stood there, caught between stepping away and pushing the door open, when her voice broke through again, barely above a whisper. "It's not fair," she murmured, her words thick with tears. "I did everything right. I worked so hard. And it's still not enough. She pressed the tissue to her face, her breath hitching. They're going to lose the house and I can't fix it. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she curled forward, as if the weight of it was too much to carry upright. Vin's jaw tightened. He knew that kind of pain, the kind that felt like it was clawing you apart from the inside. He'd grown up with it, watching his own mother struggle to keep the lights on, promising himself he'd never let anyone he cared about feel that helpless again. He pushed the door open a fraction, just enough to see her more clearly. Emily didn't notice, too lost in her own grief. A phone lay on the table in front of her, its screen dark but littered with notifications. Texts, missed calls, a reminder about a bill due. Next to it was a crumpled letter, the kind that came from banks or landlords, its edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. Vin's eyes lingered on it, a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen letters like that before, back when he was a kid, back when every knock on the door felt like a threat. He wanted to walk away, to let her manager handle this, but his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he found himself stepping into the room, his voice low and steady, the way he'd learned to speak when he needed to calm someone down. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears. For a moment, she just stared, her breath catching as she registered who was standing there. Vin raised a hand, palm out, a gesture of peace. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I was just passing through. Heard you in here. Sounds like you're carrying something heavy." Emily's lips parted, but no words came. She wiped at her face quickly, as if she could hide the evidence of her tears, but her hands were shaking too much to manage it. "I'm fine," she said, her voice brittle, unconvincing. Just a bad night. I'm sorry. I didn't know you were here." She stood, fumbling with her apron, trying to smooth it down like it could restore some kind of order. But Vin could see the way her knees wobbled, the way her eyes darted to the letter on the table, like it was a bomb waiting to go off. He took a step closer, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. "You don't have to apologize," he said, his tone carrying the kind of warmth that came from knowing what it was to hurt. "Looks like more than a bad night to me." He nodded toward the letter, not touching it, but letting his gaze linger just long enough to show he understood. Emily's face crumpled again, and for a moment, it looked like she might break down completely. But she caught herself, pressing her lips together, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "It's my parents," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. They're losing everything. The house, the car, all of it. My dad got sick last year and the bills they kept coming. I've been working doubles, picking up every shift I can, but it's not enough. I thought I could help them, you know? I thought I could fix it." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her eyes fixed on the floor. "But I can't. And now they're going to be out on the street, and I don't know what to do." Vin listened, his face unreadable but his eyes soft, taking in every word. He'd heard stories like this before, too many, if he was honest. The world had a way of grinding people down, of taking everything they had and then asking for more. But hearing it from Emily, seeing the way her hands trembled, the way her voice carried a mix of guilt and love and desperation, it hit him harder than he expected. He thought of his own family, the sacrifices they'd made, the nights he'd lain awake promising himself he'd make it right someday. He'd built Hearth to be a place where people could feel safe, where they could find a moment of warmth in a cold world. But standing here, looking at Emily, he wondered if he'd done enough. He pulled out one of the chairs and sat down across from her, his movements slow, giving her space to decide if she wanted to keep talking. That's a lot to carry, he said, his voice low, steady. More than anyone should have to. He paused, letting the words settle, letting her feel them. You're doing everything you can. That's more than most. Emily's eyes met his for the first time, and there was something there, gratitude maybe, or just the relief of being seen. But the weight of her fear was still there, heavy and unyielding. Vin leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. Tell me about your parents, he said, his voice gentle but firm, like he was inviting her to share the load, even just for a moment. Emily hesitated, her fingers twisting the tissue in her hands. But then she started talking, her words spilling out like a dam breaking. About her dad's laugh, her mom's stubborn pride, the house they'd lived in since she was a kid, every room filled with memories she couldn't bear to lose. And Vin listened, really listened, the way he always did when someone's story mattered. The break room felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of Emily's words. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner was the only sound as she paused, her breath unsteady, her eyes fixed on the crumpled tissue in her hands. Vin sat across from her, his broad frame filling the chair, but his presence was soft, unintrusive, like a steady anchor in a storm. The dim light overhead cast gentle shadows across his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw, making him seem less like the larger-than-life figure from the screen and more like a man who understood what it meant to carry a burden. He didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence with empty reassurances. He just waited, his hands clasped loosely on the table, his gaze steady but kind, giving her the space to decide how much more she wanted to share. Emily's voice, when it came again, was quieter, as if the act of speaking drained what little strength she had left. My dad used to build things, she said, her lips twitching with the ghost of a smile. Not big things, but shelves, birdhouses, a treehouse for me when I was little. He'd spend hours in the garage, sawdust all over his jeans, humming old rock songs off-key. Her smile faded, and her eyes grew distant. He was a mechanic by trade, worked at the same shop for 20 years. Never missed a day even when he was sick. But then the cancer came, and everything changed. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the tissue until it tore. The treatments helped at first, but the bills piled up so fast. Mom tried to keep up, took on extra shifts at the library, but it wasn't enough. They're behind on everything now, mortgage, medical debt, all of it. Vin's chest tightened as he listened, a familiar ache stirring deep inside. He knew that kind of story too well, the slow, relentless grind of a system that didn't care how hard you worked or how much you loved your family. He thought of his own childhood, the nights his mother sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, her face tight with worry she tried to hide. He'd been too young to help then, but the memory of that helplessness had never left him. It was part of why he'd built Hearth, why he'd wanted a place where people could find a moment of respite, even if it was just a warm meal and a kind word. But hearing Emily's story, seeing the raw pain in her eyes, made him wonder if a place like this could ever be enough for someone whose world was falling apart. He leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting to the letter on the table. Its edges were frayed, the paper worn thin from being handled too many times. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. Words like foreclosure or final notice had a way of burning themselves into your memory. That letter, he said, his voice low, careful not to push too hard. How long have they got? Emily's gaze flicked to the paper, and for a moment, it looked like she might not answer. But then she reached for it, her fingers trembling as she smoothed it out, as if facing it head-on might make it less real. 2 weeks, she said, her voice barely audible. The bank's taking the house in 2 weeks unless they can come up with too much. She didn't say the number, but the way her shoulders slumped told Vin it was a figure that felt like a mountain. I've been sending them everything I make, but it's like pouring water into a cracked bucket. It just disappears. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes welling up again. I keep thinking if I'd gotten a better job, or worked harder, or, I don't know, maybe I could have stopped this. Vin's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger sparking in his chest. Not at Emily, but at the unfairness of it all. He'd seen too many people blame themselves for things they couldn't control, as if hard work alone could outrun a world stacked against you. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she was carrying more than anyone should have to, but he knew those words wouldn't land. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice steady but warm, like he was speaking to a friend. "You're doing more than most would, Emily," he said. "Taking on doubles, sending every dime home, that's not nothing. That's love. Your parents, they see that. They know what you're giving up for them." Emily's eyes met his, and for a moment, something softened in her expression, like his words had found a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. But the relief was fleeting, chased away by the weight of reality. "It doesn't feel like enough," she said, her voice breaking. "I keep picturing them packing up the house, leaving behind everything we built together. That treehouse is still in the backyard, you know? Dad put it up when I was 6. I used to sit up there and read, pretending I was in some far-off adventure. Now it's going to be someone else's, or worse, torn down." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that followed. Vin felt the weight of her words settle over him, heavy and sharp. He could see that treehouse in his mind, weathered by years of sun and rain, its boards still holding the echo of a father's love. He thought of his own memories, the small things that had anchored him when the world felt too big. His mother's voice singing softly in the kitchen, the creak of the porch step where he'd sit and dream of something better. Those things weren't just objects. They were pieces of a life, and losing them felt like losing a part of yourself. He wanted to do something, anything, to ease the pain in Emily's eyes, but he knew throwing money at it wouldn't fix what was breaking inside her. Not yet, at least. He shifted in his chair, his hands resting on the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "That treehouse," he said, his voice gentle. "It's more than wood and nails, right? It's your dad up there with you, telling you stories, making you laugh. That doesn't go away, no matter what happens to the house." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching the way her eyes flickered with a mix of grief and recognition. "But I get it. Losing the place where those memories live. It's like the ground's falling out from under you. I've been there." Emily looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly, like she was trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the one she'd seen on billboards and movie screens. "You have?" she asked, her voice small but curious, as if she couldn't quite believe someone like him could know what it was to lose something so personal. Vin's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile, and for a moment, he looked less like a celebrity and more like a man who'd carried his own share of scars. "Grew up in a place a lot like yours, probably," he said, his voice low, steady. "Small apartment, barely enough room for me and my mom. We didn't have much, but we had each other. Then the landlord jacked up the rent and we lost it. Had to pack up everything in a couple of boxes and start over. I was just a kid, but I remember how it felt, like the world was telling us we didn't matter." He paused, his eyes distant, the memory still sharp after all these years. "Took me a long time to realize that home isn't just a place. It's the people you carry with you. But that doesn't make it hurt any less when you're staring down a letter like that." Emily listened, her hands still, her eyes locked on his. There was something in his voice, a quiet strength that made her feel seen. Like he wasn't just saying words to make her feel better, but sharing a piece of himself. For the first time that night, she felt a flicker of hope. Not because the problem was solved, but because someone understood. She wiped at her eyes, her breath steadier now, and nodded slightly, as if his story had given her something to hold on to, even if it was just for a moment. Vin leaned back, his gaze softening. "You're not alone in this, Emily," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I don't know what's going to happen with that letter, but I know you're not carrying it by yourself. Not tonight." He paused, glancing at the clock on the wall, its hands ticking past 1 a.m. "You got anyone you can call? Someone to talk to when you get home?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Just me," she said softly. "My friends, they're great, but they don't really get it. And I don't want to burden them." Vin nodded, his expression unreadable but his eyes warm. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notepad and a pen he kept for jotting down ideas. He scribbled something quickly, then tore off the page and slid it across the table. "That's my manager's number," he said. "Not mine. I'm not that easy to reach." His lips twitched with a hint of a smile, lightening the moment. "But you call her tomorrow, tell her I said to look into some resources. There are programs, organizations that can help with medical debt, housing. It's not a fix, but it's a start. And you tell her I said to make it quick." Emily stared at the paper, her fingers hovering over it like she wasn't sure it was real. Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vin shrugged, his smile fading into something softer, more serious. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply. "And someone helped me once. Figure it's my turn." He stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and nodded toward the door. "Come on. I'll walk you to your car. It's late, and you've had a hell of a night." The night air was cool and sharp as Vin and Emily stepped out of Hearth's back door into the alley, the faint glow of a street lamp casting long shadows across the pavement. The city hummed softly in the distance, car horns, the low rumble of late-night traffic. But here, it felt like they were in a pocket of quiet, a moment carved out from the chaos. Emily clutched the scrap of paper with Vin's manager's number in her hand, her fingers curling around it like it was a lifeline. Her face was still pale, her eyes puffy from crying, but there was a steadiness in her steps now, a small shift that hadn't been there before. Vin walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, his cap still pulled low to shield his face. He didn't say anything, and neither did she, but the silence between them wasn't heavy. It felt like understanding, like two people who'd shared something real. The alley opened onto a small parking lot behind the restaurant, where Emily's beat-up sedan sat under a flickering light. The car's paint was chipped, the rear bumper held together with a strip of duct tape, but it was hers, a stubborn little thing that kept going despite everything. She stopped by the driver's side door, her keys jingling softly as she pulled them from her pocket. She turned to Vin, her expression caught between gratitude and uncertainty, like she wasn't sure how to say what was in her heart. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "For listening, for this." She held up the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. "I didn't expect anyone to care tonight." Vin's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that carried warmth but didn't linger. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Just take care of yourself, okay? And call that number. Lisa's tough, but she's good people. She'll help you figure out the next step." He paused, his eyes searching her face, taking in the way her shoulders still carried the weight of her fear, but also the flicker of resolve that hadn't been there an hour ago. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. You're out here fighting for your family. That's not small." Emily's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry this time. She nodded, swallowing hard, and tucked the paper into her apron pocket. "I'll call," she said, her voice firm, like she was making a promise to herself as much as to him. She hesitated, then added, "You didn't have to do this. You could have just walked by. Why didn't you?" The question hung in the air, raw and unguarded, and for a moment, Vin's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes, like she'd touched a nerve he usually kept hidden. He looked out at the parking lot, his gaze distant, like he was seeing something far beyond the chipped asphalt and faded lines. "I've walked by before," he said, his voice quieter now, almost confessional. "When I was younger, angrier. Saw people hurting and told myself it wasn't my problem. Told myself I had enough to carry." He shook his head slightly, a shadow crossing his face. "But you do that enough and it starts to eat at you. Makes you feel like less of a person. I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't be that guy anymore. Not if I could help it." He turned back to her, his eyes steady again. "Tonight I could help. So I did." Emily stared at him, her breath catching as his words sank in. She'd seen him as a celebrity, a name on a marquee, but now he was just a man. One who'd known pain, who'd made choices he regretted, who was trying to make things right in his own way. It made her feel less alone, like her struggle wasn't just hers but part of something bigger, something human. She nodded, a small, grateful gesture, and opened her car door. "I'm glad you stopped," she said softly. It means more than you know." Vin gave a slight nod, stepping back as she slid into the driver's seat. "Drive safe," he said, his voice carrying that same steady warmth. "And get some rest. You've earned it." Emily managed a faint smile, the first real one of the night, and closed the door. The engine sputtered to life, a rough but determined sound, and Vin watched as her taillights disappeared around the corner, the red glow fading into the dark. He stood there for a moment longer, the night air settling around him, his hands still in his pockets. The weight of the evening lingered, heavy but not unwelcome, like a reminder of why he'd built Hearth in the first place. Back inside, the restaurant felt different now, quieter, as if it had absorbed the emotion of the night. Vin moved through the kitchen, his boots soft against the tiles, and stopped by the break room door. The crumpled letter was still on the table, forgotten in Emily's rush to leave. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the worn paper, and scanned the words. Numbers in bold, a deadline circled in red, a family's life reduced to cold, clinical terms. His jaw tightened, a familiar anger stirring, not at Emily or her parents, but at a world that let people fall through the cracks. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket, a decision forming in the back of his mind, one he wasn't ready to voice yet. He made his way to the dining room, the pendant lights casting a warm glow over the empty tables. Each one held stories, families celebrating birthdays, couples sharing quiet moments, strangers finding connection over a shared meal. Vin had always believed Hearth could be more than a restaurant, a place where people felt seen, where they could leave a little lighter than when they came. But tonight, he wondered if he'd been thinking too small. Emily's story wasn't just hers. It was the story of countless others, people fighting battles no one else could see. He pulled out a chair and sat, his hands resting on the table, his mind turning over possibilities. Ways to do more, to reach deeper, to make Hearth a place that didn't just serve food but changed lives. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his manager, Lisa, asking if he was still at the restaurant. He typed a quick reply, then added, "Need you to look into something tomorrow. Housing programs, medical debt relief. Urgent." He hit send, then leaned back, his eyes drifting to the framed photo on the wall, a black and white shot of his mother, smiling in the kitchen of their old apartment, her hands dusted with flour. She'd been the one to teach him what it meant to show up for someone, to give when you had nothing left. Tonight he'd honored that, but he knew it was just a start. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 a.m., its hands moving steadily toward morning. Vin stood, his movements slow, deliberate, and walked to the front door. He flipped the sign to closed, the faint click echoing in the quiet. Outside, the city was still alive, its pulse steady and unrelenting. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool air brushing his face, and looked up at the sky, where a few stars fought their way through the city's glow. Emily's face lingered in his mind, her fear, her strength, the way she'd held on to hope even when it felt impossible. He didn't know what would happen next, whether the number he'd given her would lead to real help, whether her family would keep their home. But he knew he'd carry her story with him, just as he carried his own. The morning sun crept over the Los Angeles skyline, painting the streets in soft gold as Vin Diesel pulled his truck into the parking lot of Hearth. It was barely 7 a.m., the city still rubbing sleep from its eyes, but Vin hadn't slept much. Emily's story had stayed with him, her voice echoing through the quiet hours, mingling with memories of his own past. Nights spent wondering if the next day would bring a miracle or another blow. He stepped out of the truck, the air cool against his skin, and stood for a moment, looking at the restaurant's unassuming facade. The sign above the door was simple, the word hearth carved in warm, weathered wood, but to Vin, it was a promise, a place where people could find something steady, something real. Today, that promise felt heavier, more urgent. Inside, the restaurant was still, the tables empty, the air carrying the faint scent of last night's rosemary and thyme. Vin moved through the dining room, his boots soft against the hardwood, and headed for the small office tucked behind the kitchen. The space was cramped, barely big enough for a desk and a couple of filing cabinets, but it was where the heart of Hearth's operations lived. He sat down, the chair creaking under his weight, and pulled out the crumpled letter he'd taken from the break room. He smoothed it out on the desk, his eyes scanning the stark numbers, the deadline now just 13 days away. Emily's parents didn't know him, didn't know he'd overheard their daughter's pain, but their struggle felt personal now, like a thread tying him to his own history. He picked up the phone and dialed Lisa, his manager, who answered on the second ring, her voice crisp despite the early hour. "You're up early," she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. "What's this about housing programs and medical debt? Your text last night was vague." Vin leaned back, his gaze fixed on the letter. "Met someone last night," he said, his voice low, steady. "One of our servers, Emily. Her family's in trouble, foreclosure, medical bills from her dad's cancer. I need you to find every resource you can. Legal aid, nonprofits, anything that can buy them time or clear some of that debt. And I want to know what we can do here, at Hearth, to help people like her." Lisa was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that meant she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "I'm on it," she said finally. "I'll have something for you by noon." Vin hung up, his hands resting on the desk, his mind turning over the bigger picture. Hearth was doing $AST doing well. Packed every night, the reviews glowing, but Vin knew it could be more. He thought of Emily, of the countless others like her, people who walked through these doors carrying burdens no one could see. He wanted Hearth to be a place that didn't just feed people but lifted them up, gave them a fighting chance. He jotted down a few ideas, partnerships with local charities, a fund for employees facing emergencies, maybe even a community night where profits went to housing or medical aid. It wasn't a solution to everything, but it was a start, a way to make sure no one felt as alone as Emily had last night. He stood and walked back to the dining room, his eyes drifting to the framed photo of his mother on the wall. Her smile was warm, her eyes bright with the kind of strength that had carried them through the hardest years. Vin felt a pang in his chest, a mix of gratitude and resolve. She'd be proud of this, he thought, of the man he was trying to be. He pulled out his phone and texted Emily, a simple message. "Lisa's working on it. Hang in there." He didn't expect a reply. She was probably still asleep, exhausted from the night before, but he wanted her to know she wasn't forgotten. As the morning unfolded, the restaurant began to stir. The first staff members arrived, their voices carrying through the kitchen as they prepped for the lunch rush. Vin stayed in the background, helping where he could, carrying a crate of vegetables, wiping down a counter. His presence quiet but steady. He didn't tell them about Emily, didn't share the weight of the night before, but it showed in the way he moved, the way he looked at each of them a little longer, like he was seeing them anew. When Emily arrived for her shift, her face was tired but composed, her apron tied neatly around her waist. She caught his eye across the room and gave a small nod, a silent thank you that carried more weight than words. Vin watched her move through the tables, her smile returning as she greeted customers, her warmth undimmed despite everything. He felt a swell of pride, not just for her but for what hearth could mean to people like her. The lunch rush came and went, the dining room alive with laughter and clinking glasses, and Vin stayed until the last table cleared out. He locked up, the afternoon sun warm on his shoulders, and stepped into his truck, the letter still in his pocket. He didn't know if Emily's parents would keep their home, didn't know if the resources Lisa found would be enough, but he knew he'd done what he could, and that was enough for now. As he drove away, the city stretching out before him, Vin felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. Hearth wasn't just a restaurant. It was a beginning, a place where stories like Emily's could find a voice, where kindness could take root and grow. He'd keep showing up, keep listening, keep fighting for the people who walk through those doors. And somewhere, he hoped, his mother was smiling, knowing her son had found his way home.